Now, no matter how good you can cast with a bait casting reel, one thing no human being could avoid is this. Now, this has different names though. When KVD has it, it's called professional overrun.
I got lined up and Kevin fires out and he blows his reel up. He goes, "Damn it!" Dude, and I just got a hook in my hand.
When weekend anglers have it, it's called backlash or bird's nest, or stir-fried noodle by my native tongue. And finally, when newbies have it, it's called nightmare and frustration. Now, I still remember the first time I ever used a bait casting reel. I got a mess on every single cast. The last one was so bad that I had to take it back home to have my mom help untangle the line, and it took her 2 hours. The bait caster truly became a nightmare for me. The frustration was so bad that I felt there was a dark force working against me, hidden in every single cast I made. Now, I'll tell you how I finally taught myself to use bait caster in another video. But for the dark force part, it's not rhetoric, it's not fiction. It truly exists. Now, this is our topic today, and I guarantee if you stay to the end, we will together find a solution for a few of long-standing casting problems. So let's roll the tape. Now, when you make a cast, the lure flies off from the rod tip, bringing line behind it, and the outcome of a cast, whether it's assessed by the distance or accuracy, is defined by where the lure lands. So any force that has a negative impact on the lure's flying are the forces we anglers should care about. And some are obvious or visible, some are not obvious or invisible, aka the dark force. Now, before we deal with the dark force, let's first quickly look at the major visible forces. Now, when the line is peeling off the bait casting reel, the braking force, be it from the spool tension or main brake, will have an impact. The line in contact with the level line will have friction and certainly will have an impact as well. Now, in the case of spinning reel, the line peeling off the spool causes friction between the line and the lip of the spool. And then, when line is going through the guides, the rings will have friction against the line, and this part will also have a big impact. So these are the major visible frictions that we know are there, because we can see the parties that are involved in physical contact. Now, to further illustrate this, let's do a little field test. Now let's do a casting test using a casting plug on a spinning setup. Now, all the casting will be very gentle, and I will be measuring the distance. I did 3 casts, and the average is 34.7 feet. Next, I'm going to cut the line about 8 to 10 feet away from the casting plug. So first I'm going to secure the line under the spool snap. I make the cut, and then I wrap the loose end a few times onto the spool until I have the same length of the line between the rod tip and the casting plug so that I can make another cast. And finally, I cut the loose tag from the loose end so that it doesn't interfere during the casting. What this does is it actually removes the friction between the line and the line guide and the spool lip after the lure flies over the first 8 to 10 feet. Now let's call it a broken line test, and then let's see what happens. So this broken line cast gave us 47 feet. Now recall the same setup at the normal average was about 35 feet, so that's 40% distance increase. So this casting comparison showed us the friction between the line and the line guides and the spool lip does exist, and it could have a big impact on the casting, especially on casting distance. Sometimes when your line has a nick and you did not know, and then you make a cast with force, and next thing you know is your line snap, and the lure flies off and never come back. Now these are unfortunately events I think many of us have experienced. But did you notice, In a lot of these accidental fly-offs, the lure actually travels way further than normal cast when the line didn't break. Now this is exactly what we just witnessed in the test. Now the line broke, it's basically taking the friction of line or guide or spool lip away, thus the lure travel more distance. Now let's summon the dark force. Now still the same spinning setup. But this time I'm going to use a jig head which is 1/8 ounce, 3.5 grams. And then on top of that, I'm going to wrap it with a big piece of white foam. 3 gentle casts. The average is 18.7 feet. Now let me do the broken line test on this one. So the same thing, cut the line about 10 feet away from the jig head, wrap the loose end on the spool and ready for the next cast. In this broken line test, we got 18 feet. Now we're done with the test. What have you seen? Recall, in our first casting distance, when we cut the line from inside, the casting distance was much longer than a normal cast. But here, no matter if the line was broken or not, the distance seemed to be the same. Now, wouldn't we expect the test to give a similar distance improvement for the foam-coated casting plug when we cut the line from inside? Now, what happened here is exactly the invisible resistance. When this foam-coated jig head was flying, it added a big piece of foam, called in much more of that dark force. So much so that this invisible dark force actually has a magnitude higher than the frictions from line guide. So essentially, this dark force was the dominant resistance during that cast. It overrode the impact from the guide and the spool lip frictions. And that's why, even if we took the frictions away from the guides and the spool lips, the distance still did not improve at all. So now let's really summon the invisible resistance, the dark force introducing the air drag. The resistance that affected the casting distance in our second test was indeed caused by the air drag. The air is not something that we can see interacting with the casting components, and also a lot of people would never consider its resistance to be affecting the casting as a major source. So that's why I call it dark invisible force. Now our last casting test has also showed that this air drag could have a significant impact. It is not something we as angler can just ignore. Now air drag is everywhere during a cast, and this is also another reason to call it dark force. Unfortunately, the force be with you, that part is actually the dark forces always be with you.
May the force be with you.
So some of you may already know that air drag or resistance affects lure casting, but what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to completely break down the air drag and show you how to use our understanding of this dark force to improve our casts. Now to do this, we have to use a little bit of math, but don't be scared away, trust me, everyone can do it. So this is an equation describing the drag an object feels when moving through the air. Now in this equation, the rho is the density of air. For us, the air density doesn't really change too much between casts, so we can usually treat that as a constant. And CD is the drag coefficient. It is a coefficient irrelevant to dimension, and you can think about it as a coefficient only related to the shape of the lure. Now here's a list of the drag coefficient of common geometric shapes. The smaller the coefficient, the less drag it feels. For instance, we might think the sphere or a perfect ball shape should have small drag coefficient. Now the actual number is 0.47, which is more than 10 times higher than that of the streamlined body. That's why airplanes adopt a streamlined body shape of fuselage. Now by the way, these coefficients are measured values. You know, when they design airplane or cars nowadays, they need to run many wind tunnel tests, and these numbers are measured from these wind tunnel tests. Next, the A. Now in our case, we can conveniently regard this A as the cross-sectional area of the lure perpendicular to the traveling direction. The bigger the cross-sectional area, the higher the air drag. Now one thing we need to notice, the drag coefficient CD and the cross-sectional area A are defined by the traveling direction. For instance, this piece of a cylinder in my hand, if it travels horizontal through the air, the shape is a round tube and the cross-section is a small circle. If it travels through the air this way, but in a vertical position, and the cross-section is a rectangle much bigger than the circle. So in our fishing world, for instance, take this 110 as an example. The drag coefficient and the cross-section area is much smaller if it flies steady like this through air, right? If it spins, or somehow the hook tangles with the line and you throw it out and it goes sideways, then the coefficient and the cross-sectional area both will become much bigger. And since the air drag is proportional to the A times CD, if it spins or tangles, it will feel much more air drag than the designed flying posture. Finally, let's look at V. Now V stands for velocity. It is the relative speed of the moving object versus air. And the keyword here is relative speed. Now remember, speed is not only a number, it comes with direction. Now, forget about the air speed for a second. If I have these two lures, both moving toward each other at 10 miles per hour speed, okay, while I am sitting here, right, the relative speed of each of the lure to me is 10 miles per hour. But the relative speed of this giant dog X to the 110 is 10 plus 10 equals 20 miles per hour. So if this giant dog X keeps still, then that relative speed becomes 10 miles per hour. If the giant dog X starts to move at 10 miles per hour into the same direction the 110 is traveling, the relative speed is 0 because they cancel out. Now, imagine the giant dog X is air. So what is moving air? The answer is wind. Yes, the moving air is wind. When air is not moving, it's the calm condition or windless condition. When air is moving against the direction our lure is flying, this way, this happens when we cast into the wind. When wind is moving in the same direction as a flying lure. This happens when we cast with the wind or when the wind is behind us. Now think about this giant dog X versus 110 example. When they are moving toward each other, the relative speed is the sum of the two individual speeds to me, right? So the air drag equation is telling you it is proportional to the square of the relative speed. And what it really means is when we make a cast into the headwind, the air drag of our lure feels is significantly higher than that if we make a cast when the wind is calm. So the air drag poses a force on the lure in the opposite direction of its traveling. And Newton told us when a force is applied on an object, its speed will change, and in this case, lure will be slowed down by air drag. So as a summary of the air drag equation, the faster the relative speed, the higher the drag. The bigger the object, the more drag it gets. The larger the coefficient, the more drag. And the higher the density of the air, the more drag the lure will feel. Now you can think about a few common situations. For instance, why is the deep diving crankbait not very easy to cast? And why is the heavy jigging spoon, on the other hand, very easy to cast? Now this explains a lot of the things we might already experience. Now, some of you might still feel the air drag is unreal because you cannot feel it acting on ourselves unless we parachute off a plane or if we do a bungee jump. But actually, since the drag equation is true for any object moving through any fluid, so if you actually replace the air density with water density, and this equation is still true to describe an object moving through the water. To this end, as long as you have tried retrieving a lure, you have already felt it. For instance, the bigger deep diving crankbait take a lot more force to move than a slender jerkbait. Right? This is because the deep diving crankbait has a much higher CD and A. Now for the same crankbait, if you crank it really fast, then you will feel more pull from the bait than if you crank it slowly. Or if you fish in a river, you cast out your lure and retrieve it while it was being carried downstream. By the end of the retrieval, your lure is swimming against the current, and we all have felt a much higher drag in this situation. In both cases, the drag is increased due to the increase of relative velocity of your lure versus the fluid, in this case, the water. And recall, the drag is proportional to the square of the velocity. So a small increment of the velocity v, there will be a big jump in the drag. And this is why you don't want to crank the deep diving crankbait too fast, but otherwise you can get fatigued really quickly. And to this point, we have perhaps all felt the drag from water, and the air is simply the same. The difference is the density of air is much smaller than water, but the lure travels much faster in air during casting than retrieving in water. Okay, that might be a little bit too much math. I hope you're still with me. I know people usually do not like math. It looks nerdy and not cool. But actually, it's pretty cool, especially when it is put into a context or reality. And you can never solve a problem before seeing a problem. And today, what we have done is we have seen this problem. We have visualized this dark force, the air drag. In our next video, we'll put this dark force equation into the context of a real fishing world and see what it has to offer to practically solve casting challenges. So stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next one.